Hello and welcome to tonight's event, which is a special preview of the new restoration of Ousmane Sembène's Mandabi. My name is Duncan Carson and I have responsibility for the independent cinemas distribution projects. I was very excited, in a time long hard to imagine ago in the past, before the pandemic, when the opportunity to release this film came round for the Independent Cinema Office. Not just because of how rare it is to see an African film released in the UK, not just because of its position in cinema history, not just because of how few African classics are restored to this stunning level, but because it's as funny, sharp, and poignant as the day it was made. And sadly, given it was made post-independence in 1968 and was the first African feature made in a native language, part of me wishes this film wasn't still so relevant. But that's what we're here to talk about tonight. Why Ousmane Sembène, what Ousmane Sembène saw so clearly in 1968 and why it still speaks today. We're really grateful for the support tonight of the BFI, who are awarding funds to the National Lottery, and our partnership with Studio Canal on this release. And if you've watched the film in advance of the screening, please do tell a friend that we'll be releasing the film in cinemas on 11th of June. We have got cinemas in all 4 nations of the UK signed on to partner with us. So do tell a friend. I'm sure it's playing somewhere near you. And if it's not, just talk to us and we'll sort it out for you. And I should say this is the first event in a series of discussions called the Cinema of Ideas. We'll be sending around a sign up after the event if you want to hear more about this series of events. So look out for that. If you'd like to ask a question during the event, but rather than putting it in the chat box, do put it in the Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. And I'm really glad to say we've got closed captions available tonight, professionally produced. So just hit the CC button to access those if you're in need of hearing what the speakers are saying. I'll now take the chance to introduce the panel that I'm so pleased to be joined by tonight. Your host tonight is Liz Chege, Director of Africa in Motion Film Festival, which brings the best of African cinema to Scotland and is now in its 15th year. She's in conversation with Aboubakar Sanogo, who is Associate Professor in the Film Studies Department at Carleton University in Ottawa and an expert on African cinema. He is working on 2 books currently in manuscript, The History of Documentary in Africa and The Indocile Image, The Cinema of Medhondo. So I'm hoping at some point in the future, I'll be able to realize my dream of releasing Medhondo's West Indies, and Aboubakar can come back for that some blessed day. And our final speaker tonight is Ivan Mbowa, who is East Africa Managing Director of Tala's Kenya subsidiary. Tala is a mobile technology and data science company focused on the expansion of credit to the underserved. Tala has now served over 4 million customers and distributed $1 billion in loans across 4 countries. And if you've seen the film, you'll understand why such a company is so relevant to discussion of Mandabi today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Liz. I'm really excited about the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Duncan. First, I want to thank the ICO for making this event possible and for their support in the release of this great film by Sembène. I'll start with Dr. Sanogo, and it will be about the restoration of this film. What does it mean to have this film restored? And there are many in the audience who might not be aware of the process behind the restoration of a film. What does it mean to make it digitally stabilized? And why does it take so long?
Well, thank you for having me. I was not involved in the restoration, I have to tell you that. And so, but it's important that the film is obviously coming back now. First of all, it's on the heels, I would say, of a series, let's say, we can call a movement toward the restoration of a number of African films in the past decade or so, that really seek to bring these films back that may not have circulated properly when they were released, or simply that new generations are simply unaware of. And so it's part and parcel of the necessary and indispensable work of transmission of the legacy of African cinema, the memory of African cinema, to Africans, of course, but also to the world, because the memory of Africa is the memory of the world. And so this film is probably the third major film by Sembène that's being restored. The first two were Black Girl and Bottom Sadet, which were done by the Film Foundation. This one was done, I believe, by Studio Canal, so in France this time. And again, I don't know the specific detail because I was not involved. So I can't really tell you what happened behind the scenes. I can tell you that I was very impressed by the restoration, in particular the beauty of the colors of the film. Those of us who have seen the film a while ago and seen it on DVD or VHS know how beat up the colors were. I mean, I was struck, for example, how many times the majesty of the baobab tree appears in the film in watching it. If you see when James walks toward the city to cash his money order, or when he walks toward visiting his nephew who will fleece him of his money order, you have these majestic shots of the baobab, which of course are a fantastic symbol not only of Senegal, of Africa, of memory, of time, and really an interrogation, a very beautiful encapsulation of the question of what kind of new Africa is being brought into this world, which is essentially the kind of the film that Sembène is trying to make in this particular case. So I was fascinated by the really the lushness of the colors, in particular because it was also Sembène's very first full-length feature film in color, right? So we have to remember that. And so the question of color for Sembène was obviously a question of ambivalence. On the one hand, he had already actually used color in a small sequence of Black Girl. There's a sequence when Black Girl sort of travels from the port to the city of Antibes, I believe, where her bosses live. I don't know, those of you who know a bit of Sembène might know. It's a bit of the arcane of Sembène cinephilia here. But there was a beautiful scene where she saw, in other words, France in full color, so to speak. And this, as I said, is the first time he really uses it in a feature film. And he does it beautifully because it really captures lots of the textures of an African city, of African life, of contemporary Africa, of the clash between various modalities of living in Africa in the 1960s, the beautiful costumes, of course, the costume design just comes off so beautifully. And obviously he took a particular amount of time and attention to really make them look as crisp, as great as possible. And so it's a fantastic restoration that we are pleased to welcome. I'm very pleased that the film is being shown, obviously, in the UK. I don't know if when the film came out, it came to the UK. I'm not sure. Maybe some additional research should be done about this. But when it came out, it did circulate more or less in various European countries, definitely in France, definitely in Sweden, definitely in several, and possibly may have passed through the UK. It's important also because, of course, it brings us to memory, of course, this giant of African cinema, giant of world cinema. What I like to think of him as a continent man. In other words, very few men have been associated with the destiny of a continent within the context of an individual art form like the moving image, and he's very much that. So his work, his artistic practice, his vision are all brought back in the process. And I really hope, I don't want to put a plug for the film, but I hope everybody goes to see this film. It's an absolute must. It's one of the films that, you can, if you check that you've seen, I don't know, The Bicycle Thief, that you've seen Citizen Kane, well, you should also check from now on that you've seen Mandabi among some of the most important films.
Great. I love that you've also talked about the color, which was my next question. So it's good that you've covered that already. I see a note from Duncan. He says this is the first time the film has received a full release in the UK. So it's historic in many ways. Thank you. Thank you for that great answer. I felt the same. I've seen Boram Saret, the restored version as well, and it was just as vivid to me as Mandabi. So I'll move on to Ivan for a second. You and I have had so many conversations about how we can best be supportive of our families and our parents when they retire, and especially in countries that don't have robust structures like the NHS and so on. And Mandabi led me to think about how much of our identity is as citizens within borders that were manufactured by empire. These are not our borders, right? So it made me think about how much of our identity is kind of tied to objects. So, you know, the birth certificate, the passport, the ID, and how you can't pretty much get anything done without these documents. And so I was wondering, for the people who are in the audience who might be very surprised to hear that there are millions of people on the continent who don't have bank accounts for very many reasons, maybe help give a context for the reasons behind that.
Oh yeah, there are a number of reasons actually why a lot of barriers exist in terms of access to financial services. And I'll probably call out physical proximity. I'll call out documentary requirements. I'll call out literacy requirements and just generally cost of transactions. So physical proximity, in a lot of Africa, the majority of bank branches and sort of financial services branches are usually clustered where you have a density of a population. So it really biases in favor of those who live in urban areas. And if you think about people in rural settings, it can often become impractical to even try and access financial services, meaning even if you had an account, you'd have to spend a lot of money and time, getting the transport, traveling towards a branch, doing your banking, and then getting back to your house. So that's one way in which the literal physical proximity of services sort of knocks you out. And I know, sort of going back to, I guess, some colonial era relics and restrictions, identification, that is actually still a critical thing over here. And you know, I'll tell you, in Kenya, we have a subset of the population, which are the Nubians. So they have sort of heritage from Sudan, where they came down, ancestry came down maybe 100 years ago. And in many ways, they're still victims and seen as others. So even though they're born in Kenya, because maybe their great grandfathers and fathers did not have access to national ID, the curse goes all the way back down to the children and grandchildren. So literally today in 2021, there are still, you know, a subset of Kenyans in this country, in the middle of Nairobi, who have Nubian heritage and cannot access national identification because their grandfather and fathers didn't have it because they were deemed to be sort of these outsiders that were living in the city. So that's actually still, you know, I was thinking about the main character in Mandabi. It's really sad that almost 55 plus years later, if, you know, someone were to try and send remittances through to a Nubian or any character here in Kenya, they'd go through some of the same challenges. They'd turn up and say, well, I have money, but okay, show me your government ID. And that could actually be a significant restriction. Something else that's actually a bit of a barrier in terms of access to financial services is cost of transactions. And I'll sort of bring you to mobile money, which Africa has received a lot of acclaim for, right? Now we are, in many ways, we've been able to leapfrog beyond some of the barriers associated with physical bank accounts and physical bank branches by giving the majority of our population access to mobile money, just based on those who have actually access to a phone. So if you have a phone and a SIM card, suddenly you actually have a virtual wallet. But the challenge is that mobile money can be very expensive, especially for those at the bottom of the pyramid. So if I am sending as little as $1 to $5 to you, it can cost as high as 9% to send that to you and for you to actually transfer it into cash, right? So it's a bit of a perverse logic where we've been able to essentially go from a world where maybe in most countries, 10% of people had bank accounts. Suddenly, maybe 60 to 80% of the population has theoretically a mobile money account. But even once you have that account, it's still very expensive to transact. And that becomes a barrier to people wanting to receive value and also transact. And then finally, I'd probably say literacy, right? Which is, so even when you do have access to products, your ability to be financially literate enough to know which product to actually choose, which product is cost effective, can also act as a barrier. And there's a sense that in many ways, certain financial products are for certain socioeconomic classes, right? So if you think about many disenfranchised communities, they'll say, a bank account is not for me. I do not use these products. These are for wealthy city people. So these are just some of the barriers in general. Like, I think about it, it's physical proximity, cost of transactions, documentary requirements, and literacy.
Thank you. It's a shame. And
Yeah.
I hadn't realized, I knew it was bad, but I hadn't realized it was still the case, which is really disappointing to hear.
Yeah.
But there are solutions. There's a service here called World Remit, which was founded by a Somali British man, I believe. And I use that to send money home. But of course, again, the transaction costs can be punitive in many ways. So yeah.
Exactly.
Sure. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So Dr. Sanogo, to bring it back to the film, Ibrahima, the lead character, he's a man kind of left behind in post-independence world. And we see that there's this cultural conflict between the Francophone elite in the suits and the regular man in the margins. In a previous interview, you spoke so well about how Sembène uses his work as a critical meditation to transform the real and not simply as a diagnostic of the real. And when I saw this film, maybe because, like we were just discussing with Ivan, I've seen so many examples in my own life. Anyone who's had to deal with the Home Office listening knows what I'm talking about. Like, you have to constantly, prove that you're a real person. And so for me, it felt like I was bearing witness and not just being a spectator. And I wondered if you could please elaborate on your thoughts about Sembène's Africanization of cinema and the use of Wolof in the film. Oh, Dr. Sanogo, you're still on mute. I don't know.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Can
there
you
I
hear
can
me?
hear you. Yes, yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. Everything you said is really very interesting because let me just answer your question and then I'll go back to it. So the Africanization of cinema, obviously, you have to remember why Sembène decided to make films. Yeah, so he was a man of letters. He used to write, and so he came upon this epiphany, according to which, obviously, noticing that people could, obviously, because of the literacy, we're going back to Ivan's literacy, where people could not read, most Africans could not read and write, certainly in the colonial languages that were the official languages of the countries after independence. He felt that the question of the problem of the relevance of his work was raised. Who is my audience? Who am I writing for? Right? And so from that, he decided, well, maybe through the cinema I could reach the African people more effectively in order that we could together work toward transforming our new Africa, the way we had imagined it when we were struggling against colonialism. And so to a large extent, all of Sembène cinema really revolved around trying to answer this question. Where is the Africa that we had dreamed of when we were trying to get rid of the Europeans? Where is it today? Where is it to be found? And so it became, therefore, a diagnostic cinema. Right? So going methodically from the first film, I would even say to the last film in many ways. Now, one of the ways in which one could reach the African audience, of course, if you notice, he started making films in French, right? But of course, the majority of the African population does not speak French, certainly in the 1960s, at in the so-called former Francophone colonies, nor do they English in the former British colonies, etc., etc. And so the question of the relevance and the ethics even, and the politics of creation of one's aesthetics is posed. And hence the question of the centrality of language in his work. What would it mean to use African languages to make African images for African audiences? Right? And by the time he manages to resolve this, let's say to resolve, and I think he really resolved this question in this film. If you look even at the credits, he takes specific pains to write the credits in Wolof. I don't know if you saw that, right? So it's not written by, directed by, etc., etc. He translates all that into Wolof, right? To really position this question of reappropriation of the African image. So the question of reappropriating the African image passes through also imposing the African languages on the question, on the moving image, period, right? Because of course the moving image is not solely images, right? So languages are also a reservoir of images that now become a source of inspiration for people like Sembène. I don't know if you recall this beautiful sequence when Borjeng decided to fight back against, let's say, the encroachment of all the neighbors who were trying to get something from. There's a beautiful sequence where they only speak in proverbs, right? Where the question of the mastery of, let's say, the semiotic codes of African languages, where, so they each trying to manipulate the proverbs in order to have the other, let's say, adopt their position. Right. And this is really, I would say, one of the most fantastic contributions of Sembène to the language of cinema. And I think it even reminds me of Ivan Chege, if you recall this, that quote what he had. I can't remember. He said, "Proverbs are the palm wine with which words are eaten." I think, if my memory is correct. I may be paraphrasing it improperly. Right. And so it really puts this question of language and everything around it, right? I mean, this film is really about really all the, let's say, ways of being, singing, ways of behaving. How does one hold oneself in public? How does one relate to the other, to their neighbor, the issues of solidarity? All these things are really embedded in part in the problematic of language. And so through language, it's an entire worldview that is brought in effect into life in the moving image to precisely demonstrate that the cinema is of course as African as it can get, so to speak, and that coming, at least as far as he's concerned, in the 1960s into using this medium means literally reappropriating them, giving the cinema an African accent, an African language. And he clearly does it both not only through the use of Wolof language, through everything that I said, but even through the symbolism, etc., because the language is a reservoir of an immense archive of historical production, of cultural production, of scientific production, of mathematical production, etc., etc. That's really what is at stake here. And so to Africanize the cinema is all that. Is all that, not just having a bunch of Africans on screen, but really all that millennia long baggage of creativity, of inventivity. Let's not forget, it's not only Africanizing, in fact, the cinema, it's really humanizing the cinema, because as you know so well, the human being of whatever hue, location, language, culture, etc., stood up for the very first time in Africa, in precisely that region that both of you are coming from, right? That's where humanity rose for the first time. And so in actually bringing African languages, we are actually bringing back the memory of the human themselves in their ability to create culture, to imagine, etc. And so that's why Sembène is very frustrated by the situation because he knows the possibilities. He knows that Africa invented culture and the humanities and the sciences and all that. And here we are in 1968, you can't even cash a check. I mean,
Yeah.
so these are some of the stakes, it seems to me.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you've actually touched on something else that I thought about in the film, was how education isn't a guarantee of moral sensitivity. So even the elite behave so terribly to everybody else. You know, everyone's squeezing each other. I think I'll come to you, Ivan, because there's something around what you mentioned with the barriers, and I can't help but not talk about the fault lines of gender in this film. You know, I thought to myself, why didn't Abdu send the money order to his mother? And then, of course, you realize at that time she probably couldn't be able to cash it anyway, right? So, and I love this quote in the film where someone says, "Don't let women mislead you. Man is the remedy for man."
Right. I remember that.
Yeah.
I remember.
And so I'll come to Dr. Sanogo in a minute, but Ivan, I wondered if even now in your work, do you find that this imbalance is still there, whether within the industry or with the customers that the finance industry deals with?
Yeah, I think we've come a long way in terms of just being a lot more cognizant of gender bias in the way in which we position products, the way in which we evaluate customers' ability to take on products. As you correctly said, I mean, even here in Kenya, in the 1970s, you couldn't open a bank account as a woman without the sort of written permission of your husband, right? You couldn't even operate it. So there's this almost infantilization. And, you know, so now obviously that doesn't exist, thankfully, on the banking side. But in many ways, there might be some slightly more subtle bias that does exist. So it could be in simple ways like saying, you can access this product if you're salaried. And then you start looking at the gender split of salaried individuals in the population. Maybe it's skewed more male than female. Or potentially in some ways we as lenders, right, are looking for behavioral signals that could be slightly more affiliated with male borrowers or male customers. It's a lot more subtle now. Let's just say that there's no overt bias that you face. But when you go into rural parts of Africa, and I'll talk about Kenya, I think you will find things like mobile phone ownership is lower for women than men, right? And so therefore, if you say that people can access bank accounts using their mobile device, well, then immediately some women are disadvantaged. If you go into, as I mentioned, employment earlier on, so formal employment, you might sort of see this bias. And let's just ultimately say that it may be easier for men to access, let's say, credit and other financial services, but it won't be the sort of overt bias that used to exist in the 1970s or so here in Kenya.
Thank you, Ivan. And Dr. Sanogo, I wondered if maybe you could talk about how Sembène handles gender in not just Mandabi, but generally in his work.
Well, let's start with Mandabi. I mean, I think it's important to remember that Sembène is really at heart a dialectician. In other words, he does not really like to create what you call ideal characters. So all characters, regardless of the category to which they belong, so to speak, would have sets of contradictions, right? So here in the case of Mandabi, you have obviously women who are supposed to be submissive, who are supposed to obey their husband, to not make decisions without his knowledge, to not lie about his health when he gets beaten up, etc., etc. In other words, to really fulfill that stereotypical role, gender role that may be expected of them. But if you look at the film closely, you also see that, in fact, the real bosses are the women in the film, right? Right? So they see very clearly they are the smartest, right? They're the ones who actually come with excuses to protect him, precisely, right? So they're extremely savvy about how to manage the economic domain of the familial polity, so to speak. And so, and if you look at the role of the sister, precisely, you can see that they can also really have an ascendance over the man. So in other words, it's not really just only a question of the dominance and resistance, so to speak. It can be found in the same characters, in the same figures, in the same categories, if you will. More broadly, obviously, Sembène has been seen as really one whose commitment to really making sure that the participation of women in the transformation of Africa is really at the center of his cinematic project. We see that already from the very beginning with Black Girl. You see that it ends with the woman taking on the task of really bringing back the means of subsistence to the family. We see that his next film is, at least his next feature film, is centered again around a woman who has to travel to Europe precisely to eke out a living, etc., etc. And some of the dynamics, in fact, of Black Girl are found again in Mandabi about sending remittances, etc., etc. So we see Mandabi, and we see, I think toward the end of his, Chedo, of course, and the role of the fantastic princess of the film, Emitai, where it's really women, she shows precisely that cowardice is to be found more on the side of men than on the side of women. Emitai is all about that in many ways, etc., etc. I can go on and on in his filmography, and the last film, if you recall, is really that women who take on themselves to completely transform a culture from within, right? Using precisely the semiotics of that very culture, not through NGO and so on and so forth, but really that because he's a dialectician, he believes that every culture has both the means to make people subservient and the means to emancipate people. The two are in every culture. And so he precisely, the part of his prayer is really to put those two in conflict and see the possibility of emergence of transformation in the process. And so in that sense, he's really very much a student of the Soviet filmmakers, because montage is at the heart, at the key, at the center of his project. It's not only putting two images in proximity, but really putting problematic in a dialectic relationship with each other. We're really describing character in a dialectic relationship, even within the character, between the characters, and of course in the larger social polity. So it's really very, very interesting take on the real, which is fundamentally a dialectic. And so the role of women is part and parcel of that, because of course he also showed that women can be on the side of oppression. If you see, Molade is all about that, right? That the women who are performing the Molade are on the side of oppression, right? Yet Kole Ardo becomes the one who brings about that voice, that counter voice, if you will, that really brings again the global societal transformation in the process. So he's not an angel, but he's not an angel. He doesn't have an angelic view of either men or women. He finds that they are both capable of both the best and the worst, but that it is important, really, that at least structurally, societal structures are not set against women. And that was very, very clear throughout his work, it seems to me.
Thank you both. This is a good point to remind the audience that you can still put questions in the Q&A part of Zoom at the bottom. Yes. I only have several more questions, so please feel free to add some in the Q&A box. One of my favorite scenes was there's a prayer sequence where Ibrahima gets out of the car and gives thanks and is doing a prayer in the middle of the road, and then passers-by kind of join him, including an officer who's giving parking tickets or something like that. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the spiritual practice represented in his work. There's a quote by him that I really liked where he says, "One soul man is never the protagonist. It's the group that produces the man." And maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Sanogo, and then Ivan, you can tell us what your favorite sequence in the film was.
Now, the role of the spirit is actually a very interesting aspect of Sembène's work. There's a sort of spectrum of position that he himself has adopted, biographically in his life. He was born in a Muslim family, right? But he became a communist. So he went to the other side of the spectrum, right? Now, that being said, his question is always, how does one productively, creatively represent, also realistically represents the African people? He knows that Africans, that there are strong elements of Africans who are believers, who believe in either Islam or in Christianity or in African religions, right? So that spectrum exists, there's no problem. And so, but he knows, at least he is intimately convinced that religion is not the solution for the future of Africa. That is very clear. So while he will cast Muslims as protagonists of his film, he always showed that Islam leaves them behind. For example, you see in this film, well, Jen, for example, okay, he misses prayer. He always has his bead really close to his heart because he doesn't want something wrong to happen to him. But something wrong does happen to him, right? He gets fleeced of his money. He never manages to himself cash the check, etc. So there are ways in which, if your religion is not really, in his opinion, the response to the problem that the continent faces, and instead that issues of solidarity, issues of struggle, precisely, are where the way forward lie. And so that really you can see throughout the film. If you recall, when Borom Saret goes to downtown with his cart, he also prays that they don't take the cart away, but the cart is taken away, sorry, right? Again, so he's really, I think he's more interested on almost a kind of secularization of the religious phenomena, right? So he loved the costumes, he loved the practices and the solidarity that they created, but minus the divine aspect of it, right? Right? And so, and this is even even more clearly exposed in his film of the 90s called Gelua. If you remember, he pits together Christians and Muslims around, led to the burial of the Christian figure in a Muslim cemetery. But at the end of the day, it is neither Christianity nor Islam that saved the day. It's really a certain sense of an African humanism that actually transcends both, that manages to bring people together at the end of the day. And that is really, really important to keep in mind. So, yeah.
Great. Yeah, I always wondered in the film, is he giving out of the kindness of his own heart, or is he doing it to prevent the wrath of God? And you're never quite sure where he lies. Ivan, did you have a favorite scene or sequence in the film?
I did. First of all, I have such limited experience with the sort of Francophone cinema. And so this is probably one of the few Francophone cinema pieces I watched. And then the fact that it's from 1968, one of the oldest, the whole thing was this anthropological beauty for me. But what was most interesting was at the beginning, that sequence where his wife prepared that excellent meal for him. I couldn't believe how much time was spent by the filmmaker as he sort of, thoroughly enjoying the meal, belching and praising his way through. It was an almost surreal amount of time spent on those scenes. But in a strange way, I just sort of could fully understand just how pleased he was by that meal. It's it's bizarre. I know it's one of the most, it's not a profound sequence, but it's stuck in my mind. I'd never seen spend that much time spent on, let us watch a man going through his meal, finishing it, watching this idea of man as king in his home. I mean, it just, everything was fascinating. Let's put it like that. It's, in 2022, 2021, it's fascinating to go back to 1968 and see the Lord in his castle, man and the king in his house. I love those scenes. I don't know. It was very interesting for me.
I love that you picked that, because I also really enjoyed the opening sequence where it's all about his grooming and kind of his pride and his vanity in a way, which was really interesting to see. Dr. Sanogo, did you have a favorite scene or sequence?
I mean, these are some of my favorites, obviously, because I think this is, in particular, the film itself compared to the other films. And I think I've said elsewhere that it really is one of the most sensual films by Sembène in many ways. Really, the body is king almost in this film, right? And nowhere more clearly than in of course, the lunch scene, the elaborate lunch scene, but also, when, the wife massages the husband and so on and so. I mean, these are absolutely classic moments in the film. But to come back to the moment you mentioned, I mean, I think that it's not a banal scene. In fact, if you think about it, I mean, part of the question is also the training of the look. In other words, that we have to learn again how to look at our culture, how to wonder, right? Because it's really a reinvestment, a kind of reenchantment even of the most potentially banal events of our life, such as taking a meal. But for him, in fact, even narratively, it's not banal, because it must be the first good lunch in years that he's had, considering that, he has been unemployed, as they say, for 4 years, no less, right? So one could imagine that for the past 4 years, it's been hard having a lunch like this. And so the question of really, again, sort of slowing down and therefore having a kind of philosophical approach to time, that is one that is not ready to cut and move to the next sequence, but really a kind of really making time felt in the cinema by the spectator, and in the process making the culture felt, right? Making the language felt, making all that is part of, because it is, to some extent, a ritual as well, right? All that is part of that ritual to be really felt very deeply by the audience that he is addressing primarily, which is the masses of African people. And people have said, of course, that these are, the people who saw the film contemporaneously in the 1960s. These are some of the most memorable ones in their mind, certainly back there in Senegal, although he was also criticizing for only showing the bad side of Senegal, as is often the case for filmmakers of that category, who are invested, if you will, in a kind of critical cinematic project. Yeah. So anyway, I'll leave it there.
Thank you both of you. We've got some questions from the audience. The first is from Richard Ross. He says, "Thank you for this illuminating discussion. At the end of the film, the postman says, 'We will change things.' Do you think, did things change in Senegal, and did the film help to change things?" So I guess this is a question for you both. Ivan, I know you've worked in West Africa, maybe not Senegal, but do you have any idea about what the transactions and the finance industry is like at the moment?
Should I start? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I've worked in Anglophone West Africa. Naturally, given I wouldn't try and get by my French. But how much have things changed, I think, is really the key thing. What I found shocking is the truth of the more things change, the more they stay the same. You know, when I think about what would happen with remittances, the same obstacle that existed in 1968 still exists today in 2021. The way in which an entire ecosystem is dependent on remittances is still the same today. You know, this idea, you know, one nephew's remittances into a family member support such a wide network, right? From the family of the recipient to the shopkeepers and everyone else, the church, you know, the Muslim clerics, you name it, right? So that is still very true today. I would say that on the surface, yes, things have improved. You know, our countries have much larger GDPs. You know, if you take a screenshot of Senegal today versus the Senegal depicted in the movie, it looks a lot more like Paris than it did in 1968. But beneath that surface, there's still a lot of the same anxieties and beliefs, and unfortunately, the tendency for even betrayal by family members. I mean, people are people, right? It's like, I think one thing I loved in the movie, by the way, was this idea of nephews, right? One nephew sends money, the other nephew helps him access money from the one nephew, and another nephew steals it, right? And it's just, I think if you would ask a lot of people today, I think the filmmakers talk about human nature, right? So if you'd ask me, what's the likelihood of what happened in the movie repeating itself in 2021? 100% likelihood of repetition. But things have also improved, but that's also the nature, that's just human nature as well. Yeah.
Dr. Sanogo, did the film help to change things in Senegal? You're on mute.
So I don't know if it helped to change things in Senegal. I mean, the part of the question, I think, let's say the long-lasting questions of the film is really the question of the structures, right? The underlying structures on which this entire situation rests, right? And so the underlying structure still is, of course, that African elites have a problem. There's a disconnection, or at least a disjuncture, between African elite and the vast majority of the population. That has not changed. The question of in other words, the inability, therefore, precisely, of the post-independent, post-colonial state, for that matter, to really respond genuinely to the aspiration of the majority of people still remains a question today for our politics, right? Yeah, I think Ivan was mentioning the question of the distance, for example, that one has to travel to go to a bank, etc. That's Mandabi, right? That's what he does. Yeah, he needs to transport to go all the way to town to be able to even have access to the post office. So those, to a large extent, have not. And in other words, and that is really part of both the anticipatory, both the timeliness, because it was contempt. It was true, but it's still, at least unfortunately, anticipatory of our contemporary present in terms of things not having been transformed fundamentally. And I think we must really be aware of, let's say, surface transformation. Yes, there are more high rises in Nairobi and in Dakar, no doubt. But to what extent do the peasant populations of Kenya and Senegal have access to really to have the same kind of access as everybody? To what extent is the system, because we have what you can call there's a kind of neo-colonial state apparatus, or post-colonial neo-colonial state apparatus that is in effect set against the majority of people by virtue of the colonial language in which everything is administered, which excludes those who don't speak it, by virtue of, and you see, I mean, I think the film really methodically looks at the various elements of the apparatus. So the city hall, the bank, the police, etc. They're all one one machine, one aspect of the same machine that sets the leaders against the people, in effect, right? And through all kinds of trickeries, language, ideas, papers, etc., etc. And that structure has not fundamentally changed. And so the question, for example, precisely, of being able to do our transactions in African languages, for that matter, administrative transactions, banking transactions, electronic transactions, all the stuff that Ivan is involving. What's the status of African language in that, for example, right? So that fundamental problem that Sembène raises, we have not even begun to touch the surface of it. And so the film remains, in that sense, extremely relevant with, let's say, minor changes here and there. But as to really I think when I was reading the description that you sent me to invite me, you were talking about it in relation to the CFA franc and so on and so forth. And I said, but in fact, if you look at this film very closely, to a large extent, it's really, I mean, in terms of the question of transforming the structures, yes, a neo-colonial structure. In fact, so that now brings the responsibility also back to Europe to a large extent, that the entire economic system that would allow an African state to provide for its subjects, or its citizen subjects, so to speak, is in fact not in the control of Africans, right? Right? And hence the CFA franc, for example, and the monetary system, hence the economic system, hence the question of, let's say, the colonial division of labor, which is still the case, where Africans are still exporting raw material and importing a finished product. The ability of Africans to transform all that in Africa has still not been resolved majoritarily. And so in that sense, the film's really deep, let's say the hidden foundation of the problems of Africa, its exposure of that is still extremely relevant and probably could be shown again in 2055.
Let's hope things will have changed by then.
Unless.
But yeah, it's a good point, because even the currency is still has the title of colonial time. So Kenyan shillings, Ugandan shillings and cents, and so on. And in the western region is franc as well. So we still have a ways to go. We're running out of time, so I'm going to try and squeeze two more questions in. One from Maimuna about recommending any other African films from a similar time. So Dr. Sanogo, I think that's for you.
Well, see, first of all, other films by Sembène. We talked about Borom Sared, we talked about Black Girl, we talked about Nyai and others. See the film by Mustafa Alassane, because he was also, he was part of a group. So we tend to put him forward, but he was part of a collective of filmmakers who tried to make films around that time. So one of the most brilliant, let's say, filmmakers came from Niger called Mustafa Alassane, who did there's a fantastic Western film called The Return of an Adventurer, which you must absolutely see. It's doing the rounds of European cities these days, so you will or ask the independent cinema people to bring it to Glasgow if they have not already. The films of Timité Bassouri, who's a fantastic filmmaker from Cote d'Ivoire, who really made a brilliant film called A Woman with a Knife, La Femme au Couteau, which is one of the films that was involved in restoring. What else? I mean, I could go on and on and on. If you email me, I can send you. And from different African countries, different regions, obviously. From Central, from North Africa, we have a big continent. We've had a long tradition of filmmaking, and people have been making films since in fact, the early 1900s. Very few people actually know that. So it's the long history, and I hope this event, this screening, is hopefully one of the steps towards really bringing back the history, the memory of really the brilliant talent that have really worked in cinema from Africa over the years, and so feel free to keep in touch with me. I'll send you a more considered year by year, country by country, region by region set of suggestions.
Great, thank you. For my side, Maimouna, please just watch our festival in October. It will be online, Africa in Motion. Okay, so I have one more question that actually ties in quite well with one from, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Dieta Shaw, about Ibrahima's future. And so my question, which ties in with that, is the concept of home has taken a whole new meaning over the last year, as we all know. And Sembène talked often about the interaction between politics and art and his efforts to not try and, divide the two, that they're very well connected. For Dr. Sanogo, what do you think he would say about this moment in time? And for Ivan, my question is more about what are the general impressions about the future, especially post-COVID, about, with transactions and wealth sharing and so on. So maybe we'll start with Ivan and then we can finish with Dr. Sanogo. You're on mute, Ivan.
Okay, great. I hope you can hear me now. I was going to say that in the short term, I think we're all reeling from the effect of COVID, and sort of put that into perspective in Africa. Most economists forecast that our economies will shrink, right? And it could be an average of, at least this is from 2020 to 2021, at best case, maybe shrink by about 1.5%. Worst case for some small economies, it's like 7.8%. But what does that actually mean? And I think that this Mandabi movie is great because if you can really zero into remittances, the post-COVID world will see a reduction in remittances, at least for the next year and a bit. And in some countries like South Sudan, remittances is such a large part of the economy, literally 35% of the economy. That's crazy, right? If you think about that's how much they depend on these remittances. So the immediate future is bleak, right? I think it's it'll take a bit of time for our economies to sort of spring back. And for many of us in financial services, obviously that kind of correlates with an increased demand for loans. But we as providers are wary about giving out those loans because we kind of see our clients really under great, tremendous financial stress. They're not getting remittances from their relatives. Many of them have been furloughed, they've taken salary cuts, businesses down. But the future is very bright. Africa always has the fundamentals in its favor. And that's primarily, a growing population base, and as a result, growing consumption. And a lot of our economies are in transition from that colonial era of, all we do is primary commodities. We export primary commodities and we, import finished goods, but we are actually beginning to do a lot more manufacturing. So when I think about the fundamentals and the future, the Ibrahim of today, there's still tremendous hope ahead for us. And, when it comes to financial services, we are seeing even more innovation around how do we provide credit to Ibrahima? How do I determine how to lend to someone Ibrahima who has maybe zero digital footprint, right? Maybe maybe they don't have identification. A lot more innovators are now saying, we spent the first few years figuring out how to serve those who were relatively well served, and we're trying to sort of create more interesting propositions. But now we begin to think about, well, what about the great unserved, or the majority of the population? So I do think that in short, it's a good time for Africa. There's a lot of private capital looking to solve the right sort of problems. Although in the immediate near term, there will be a bit of pain, but it's never been a better time to be an African and to have problems that financial services can solve.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you so much. Dr. Sanogo, what of Ibrahima's future? What do you think Sembène might say about this moment?
Well, I think he would say many things about this moment. One, he would be depressed to see that a lot of what he said in 1968 is still relevant today. I would say that he, at the same time, remember the film ends with Ibrahim, as he said, being pushed toward doing something, toward getting involved, because he doesn't even imagine that he can be involved in the political process. And so I think that's really one of the major legacies here of this film and of Sembène. It is that really we must get involved. We should not let political decisions, financial decisions, economic decisions made by a select few at our expense. These are decisions that affect us, and therefore we must have a say in them, right? And therefore the question, and that really is at the heart of his understanding of the relation between culture and politics, right? So through culture, really, to transform politically the conditions under which we live. And so he would be obviously also inspired by the fact that young people are really very interested in making films. For example, I think more than ever, there are young Africans who are taking the camera, trying to make films, and I hope people like Ivan, who are on the business side of them, will support them, because that's really one of the problems. He suffered all his life for having to go to France, to Europe, to look for money to make film, as did Med Hondo, because precisely the question of the political economy of African culture is still, to a large extent, and just like the raw material, an extroverted one. Right? So part of the task for tomorrow is precisely to be able to finance the politics of our culture from within. Yeah. And so there is, at least, he would probably be inspired by the fact that there's an increasing, intense feeling of, let's say, Pan-Africanism, if I may call it so, a feeling that young people really would like to know what's happening in the neighboring countries, in neighboring regions, across the continent. That itself is also one of the founding structures of his work. And so he would see that as also participating in the way forward. But he would say, well, be politically aware. In other words, we should not also simply try to create an Africa that is simply one more capitalist, 1 more billion people, capitalist people, right? But to look inside the culture, the really long and complex and really unique legacies of African cultures, many of which are anti-capitalist, actually, right? To really see how we can imagine a new world whereby the absence of financing or of money or this or etc. does not produce situations like Ibrahim Ajeng is living in this video. So it's really a reimagination also of the reimagination of structures of solidarity beyond the thing called money and all the apparatus around it, and all the apparatus around it. So so these are also some of the things that he would be interested in seeing, it seems to me.
Thank you. I think I speak for everyone listening. What a privilege it has been and an honor to listen to you both. Thank you for joining in. Thank you to the ICO for this, and thank you to everybody who joined in this evening. I hope you all have a great weekend coming up, and thank you for supporting the film. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Yes.
Okay, bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.